I was in the library not too long ago looking for books on medieval history, as I often am, and I came upon a book called The Closing of the Western Mind. Reading the back cover, I surmised that it was all about how the Middle Ages were a brutal and barbaric time where rational thinking and innovation were replaced by religious extremism and superstition. I ended up taking it home with me and reading the whole thing, and I'm glad I did because it is a goldmine of misinformation, and I'm going to use some of the author's main arguments as guideposts for this video. We'll systematically dismantle the nonsense that has tainted how so many people think of the Middle Ages, which were much brighter than any Dark Ages label would lead you to believe. We'll learn about the medieval geniuses who literally shaped our ideas of language and philosophy. We'll hitch a ride with the Dark Age adventurers who explored the world long before Columbus, and we'll peer deep inside the insane machines that drove what I'd like to call the medieval Industrial Revolution. So come with me and let's travel back through the centuries to find out why everything you know about the Dark Ages is wrong and why that term is completely misunderstood in the first place. One of the underappreciated aspects of life in the Middle Ages was that things were actually built to last, which brings us to some very quick important business. This video is sponsored by Rugged Rosaries, the toughest rosaries you'll ever own. Handcrafted with military-grade paracord and heavy-duty beads, they're built to endure a lifetime of prayer. No more fragile rosaries that snap after a few uses. These are battle-ready and made to last, and right now you can get 10% off your order with code MINDSET at checkout. That's ruggedrosaries.com, code MINDSET. Carry a rosary as strong as your faith. Now onto the video. A core argument of the book, and the source of so many historical stereotypes about the Middle Ages that I still see all the time, is that ancient Greece and Rome were these hotbeds of reason and logic and technological advancement and free thinking until Christianity came along and throttled all of that in favor of blind obedience to church teaching. If you've ever watched any of my videos, you already know how ridiculous and untrue this statement is, but let's dig into it a little bit more. We tend to think that the works of the classical greats like Cicero and Virgil and Aristotle were all lost with the fall of Rome in the West and weren't rediscovered until the Renaissance, which means that medieval people went 1,000 years without access to this knowledge. The truth is, medieval scholars and theologians always knew about and fiercely protected the works of ancient writers, and Christianity acted as a preserver and redirector and reshaper of the very same logic and reason that was cultivated in antiquity. If you were to walk into a medieval monastery, it would not be a place of closed minds. Monks spent their lives and poured their entire souls into the process of painstakingly copying manuscripts from the greatest ancient minds, doing everything they could to make sure that their knowledge wouldn't be destroyed. Boethius was one of the great Christian philosophers of the early Middle Ages, the darkest period of the so-called Dark Ages, and he was taken prisoner by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. While in prison, this man who supposedly had such a closed, overly religious mind wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy, which was a dialogue with Lady Reason herself that wove together the most thought-provoking ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and Christian thought. His work ended up being copied over and over again in monasteries and became one of the most influential texts of the Middle Ages, which is just one example of how much of a premium was placed on knowledge in the medieval world. On that same note, real quick for me, look down at your keyboard. The lowercase alphabet, the spaces between the words, even the punctuation that holds it all together can be traced back to Carolingian Minuscule, a script created around 780 AD at the court of Charlemagne. If you've ever looked at a late Roman manuscript, you know it's like reading the chicken scratch of a drunken maniac, and Charlemagne wasn't having it. His scholars designed Carolingian Minuscule. Round, clear letters, spaces between words, capital letters at the start of sentences, even standardized punctuation. Renaissance humanists were so smitten with its clarity that they copied it almost exactly, so the very typeface you're reading right now is a Dark Ages survival. Here we see again that the overly religious Middle Ages didn't close minds or destroy literacy. Literacy was actually refined into a system we still use today. Charlemagne's empire had an average literacy rate far higher than most pre-modern societies, and monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were manuscript factories cranking out masterpieces with uniform precision. Another point that's made in The Closing of the Western Mind, and that I've heard quite a lot in discussions of the Middle Ages, is that Europe was closed off from the rest of the world, leading to this backwardness and stagnation. Medieval Europeans were pushing beyond the boundaries of the horizon over 700 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. By as early as the 6th century, Irish monks, yes, monks, those closed-minded Christian fundamentalists who wanted to keep the medieval world restricted, started to set out from land in small leather boats to explore the North Atlantic. A book like The Closing of the Western Mind tries to argue that Christianity held the people of the Middle Ages back, but Christianity was precisely the reason these monks undertook such a brave and dangerous endeavor. They were actually trying to find God at the edge of the map. The Navigatio Sancti Brendani from the 8th century tells how Saint Brendan and his companions sailed west in search of the promised land of the saints. Now, in typical medieval fashion, the text mentions that they encountered sea monsters and crystal pillars shooting up out of the ocean, but that's just some fantastical storytelling overlaying a real history of seafaring monks. The Irish monk de Quille in his De Mentura Orbis Terra from 825 records that Irish clerics actually lived on a northern island, which was probably Iceland or the Faroes, where at the summer solstice there is no night. Using our powers of deduction, we can safely arrive at the conclusion that de Quille is talking about medieval monks traveling to and living in the Arctic Circle, and he adds that they lived there for hundreds of years before Norse raiders drove them away. Speaking of the Norse, let's dig into them a little bit because they also fly in the face of this silly idea that Europe was closed off and uninterested in the surrounding world. You've probably heard the name Leif Erikson before, whose adventures to the land called Vinland were recorded in famous sagas, but modern skeptics usually dismiss these stories as legend, which ignores the fact that we have contemporary corroboration. In 1075, the German chronicler Adam of Bremen reported that King Svein of Denmark personally told him of another island called Vinland, because vines grow wild there, yielding excellent wine. He also mentions unsown crops growing in abundance, which seems like a pretty clear reference to the wild grapes and wheat that grew on the east coast of North America. So here we have a medieval German monk writing about medieval explorers discovering America 5 full centuries before Columbus. I want to mention too that this exploration wasn't just westward, because the Vikings rode rivers deep into Russia and founded the trade routes that became Novgorod and Kiev. They even sailed down to Constantinople, where they served as the Varangian Guard, which was the emperor's elite bodyguard. That feels like one of those weird historical facts that's tough to wrap your head around, Vikings in medieval Constantinople, but it's absolutely true. Other explorers went east into the Caspian Sea and reached Baghdad. Coins from the Abbasid Caliphate had been found in Viking hordes all over Scandinavia. So, after the fall of Rome, Europe didn't close down to the outside world and become this backwards and stagnant place. Quite the opposite, European explorers set sail with far less technology than Columbus would have had and still managed to push the boundaries of geographic knowledge. Funny enough, a lot of scholars argue that Columbus was familiar with the Viking discoveries and even read the works of Adam of Bremen, which would mean his new ideas were actually just hand-me-downs from the Dark Ages, which are starting to look brighter and brighter. I want to drill down on this idea of medieval stagnation because we've touched on it quite a bit so far, but it is one of the central arguments of the book, so I want to make sure we thoroughly debunk it. There's this historical stereotype that I've alluded to already, that there was this great empire called Rome, and then one day it just sort of ended and everything fell apart and everyone forgot all about the reading and technology and anything that could be thought of as innovation. That's a lot to unpack, and maybe we'll do the fall of Rome in a separate video, but for now I want to hone in on the idea that medieval people abandoned machines and went back to bashing grain with rocks. Let's start with the numbers. The Domesday Book of 1086 records 5,624 mills in England, nearly all of them water-powered, and let me tell you just right off the bat that a water-powered mill is not at all easy to design or build. Anyway, 5,624 mills in England works out to about 1 mill for every 250 people. For context, Roman Britain had only a few dozen known mills, although obviously we have to account for the fact that maybe not every mill was accounted for. Even factoring that in, medieval England was far more advanced in their mill building than Roman Britain, but this would lead us to a seemingly historically inconsistent conclusion. The early Middle Ages didn't reduce machine use, it multiplied it by orders of magnitude. Historian Jean Gimpel put it bluntly, the Middle Ages introduced machinery into Europe on a scale no civilization had previously known. And, contrary to what the closing of the medieval mind argues, the medieval mind didn't think small, so mills weren't just for grinding grain. Medieval engineers adapted them to crush olives, tan leather, pound iron, and even make paper. They were basically multi-tool factories representing a gradual, smaller-scale industrial revolution in Europe way before the actual industrial revolution centuries later. Mechanical ingenuity was everywhere in the Middle Ages, and it certainly wasn't limited to mills. Liutprand of Cremona, visiting Constantinople in 949, described golden lions that roared, bronze birds that sang, and a throne that rose into the air when he bowed. What he's talking about are automata, which are basically a form of medieval robotics that were usually designed to surprise and delight distinguished guests. In the West, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent Charlemagne a water-powered clock in 807 that chimed the hours and released miniature horsemen. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, described the court's astonishment at this marvel. I know I'm beating a dead horse at this point, but none of this sounds like darkness. It sounds like innovation coming from a society that was way more advanced than we give them credit for. This wasn't a technologically stagnant period when it came to farming either, because agriculture also boomed with tech. The heavy plow, appearing in the 8th and 9th centuries, transformed northern Europe's dense soils and, paired with the horse collar, an innovation that let horses pull heavy loads without choking, food production skyrocketed. More food meant more people, more towns, more cathedrals, so the Middle Ages were quite literally a period of growth, which actually eventually meant there were too many people, a problem conveniently solved by the arrival of the Black Plague. Bringing us back to our old friends the monks for a moment, it's worth mentioning that monasteries became centers of medieval mechanization. The Cistercians in particular were famous for using water power to drive entire complexes, gristmills, ironworks, tannery equipment. The American historian Lynn White Jr. once called medieval monasteries the most important patrons of technology, or to put it simply, monks weren't just praying, they were running industrial parks. This is the part where I would go in depth on the incredible engineering and architecture of Gothic cathedrals as well, but I've actually already done an entire video on just that topic called Medieval People Would Hate Modern Churches. I'll put a link to it in the description if you're interested. If you've ever been fortunate enough to visit a Gothic cathedral, or if you even look up Gothic cathedral on Google Images, you'll be blown away by the size and the scale of them, and the intricate design and the attention to detail, and the pure craftsmanship on display. These were clearly not built by technologically stagnant, backwards people living in some closed-off world obsessed with superstition. They were mathematicians and rational thinkers who built some of the most incredible structures ever dreamed up in the history of humanity. Honestly, the entire thesis of the closing of the Western mind could be debunked with just 2 words: Gothic cathedrals. Next time someone tries to tell you that the Middle Ages were dark and ignorant, ask them to explain to you how flying buttresses work. Then you might see who the ignorant one really is. But let's land the plane here. I know I've spent this entire video basically dunking on these outdated viewpoints about the Middle Ages, but I also don't want to act like it was a period of sunshine and roses that has been completely unfairly misconstrued. There were some backwards aspects to society at the time, and there was superstition and many cases of religious fundamentalism that was ultimately harmful in some ways. But to act like this is the entire story of a 1,000-year period is reductive at best and outright malicious at worst. I know we like to think of the story of humanity as mostly linear, that progress is always moving forward, and therefore our ancestors must have been much stupider and far less capable than we are. In reality, there's a lot we can learn from them, and closing the book on a millennium of human history because we've watched too much Monty Python and read too many pop history books like The Closing of the Western Mind would be outright silly. So if nothing else, the point of this video is to encourage you to open your mind to the possibility that you've been wrong about the Middle Ages, and there is much rich wisdom and tradition to be re-examined. Also, just a quick note for the people in my comments section, I am aware that the term Dark Ages is technically only supposed to refer to the centuries immediately after the fall of Rome in the West. But your average person conflates the Dark Ages with the entire Middle Ages, which is why I've used the term for this video. But anyway, what do you think of all this? Were the Middle Ages a more advanced era than we think, or am I totally off base and it was 1,000 years of stagnant nothingness? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it is simply waiting to be rediscovered.